Okay, so thank you for coming up today, and hopefully it's a lovely day where you all are, or it's been a lovely day if you're in your evenings. This week's community call is all about perceptions of preprint peer review, and I'm going to give a very quick bit of background to the landscape and then hand over to Fiona from eLife, and then we're going to hear from Nonia from PLOS Biology, and that's to really get the journal side of things. And then once we've done that, we've got a little interactive exercise planned so that we can get the feedback and sort of perceptions of everybody on this call. And they've been working all right so far, so hopefully that continues to work okay. So quick overview of what we're doing, which is what I've just said. Quick welcome. We're going to hear about perspectives of journals and editors on different preprint peer review models. We're then going to have quite a lengthy Q&A time with the speakers. This is a topic that has been on my radar quite a lot recently. I've just done quite a few events around preprint peer review, and the discussion part is always quite lively, so I figured it would be nice to have a lively discussion for this one. Then we're going to have a quick little whiteboard activity, and you'll see that when we get to it. And then we've just got a couple of community updates from ASAPbio to share before we finish the call. As always, we have our community guidelines. Please be nice and lovely to each other. Bring that LinkedIn energy to these calls. And if you have any questions, anything you want to share afterwards, please email either me or Jessica, and our emails will be at the end of these slides. So just give you a bit of background about kind of why preprints and preprint peer review is so important at the moment. So what you're seeing here are two graphs that basically tell you that although the internet has been around for quite a while now, and we're in this age where your fridge can tell you that you need to go and buy some more ingredients because you've run out, journal publishing is still stuck in that sort of medium of print, and it hasn't really developed a lot despite all these advances. But what has happened is that the time it takes to get your first author paper out has increased. And the time it takes, or the amount of work it takes to get papers out, has increased. So I particularly like this graph on the right, because it's showing that not only has the number of panels in papers from these various journals increased, but the supplementary material is actually just as big or more number of panels in there than an entire paper had in the 1980s, which is mind-blowing to me. And the thing is, peer review has also not really developed much. And there's been a few studies to try and characterize some of the problems around peer review. There's various issues with all those individual studies, but they all kind of agree that peer review needs to be changed. I've picked out this one in particular because it was a more recent one. So there's a study done this year that tried to sort of calculate how much peer review costs us globally. And this study arrived at about $6 billion as the figure, which is an insane amount of money. And then there's other work that's tried to look at sort of how much time is lost on peer review. And this one calculated over 15 million hours of lost time on peer review. And this isn't peer review is bad, this is peer review needs to be improved. Peer reviewers, and we've all got these stories of reviewer number two, can act as gatekeepers, and they can make the process of publishing difficult and not very enjoyable. But peer reviewers can also act as collaborators and actually make that whole process enjoyable and fun and collaborative, which is what peer review should really be. What you've seen here is some data that we had a few years ago from Review Commons, and we were kind of asking what reviewers who had participated in this process, what their experience was, how they felt the process had gone. And you can see across the board on the sort of answers we've got here that it was very positive. And this is exactly why people who are not part of the peer review process should get on board with that for preprints, and also why we shouldn't really be supporting the current journal model of peer review, right? We should be moving towards preprint peer review and peer reviews that are transportable with the paper, so that your manuscript doesn't get stuck in one journal that gets reviewed and then rejected, and then you've got to submit and get reviewed somewhere else. The reviews travel with the preprint. Much better way of doing things, in my opinion. But the thing that's happened recently, and this is really, I think, what is driving a lot of this discussion around preprint peer review, is that the entire feedback ecosystem particularly in the past few years, it's kind of exploded. There's just so many different initiatives now around providing reviews and comments on preprints. And these range everything from quite free-form, vague peer reviews to the kind of peer review to expect when you do submit to a journal. And it is a very broad spectrum, but all these things are peer review. And there's also these explosion tools that actually now link all these things together to make it easier to find all these things. Cite is a good example where there's now a platform so you can actually see the peer reviews in one place and you can see all the reviews together. And it just makes it easy in terms of discoverability, which is another key part of actually getting people to do these and use preprint peer review. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Fiona, who is going to talk all about eLife's new model and how that's going. Fiona, you should be able to share your screen.
Right, okay, thanks very much. Hold on, I should do that, theoretically. Perfect. Can you see that? Yep. Excellent. Yep. All right. Well, apologies for those who've probably heard this talk before, perhaps even last week, indeed. Anyway, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about eLife's new model and why we did it. What are the reasons for formulating that, and then some of sort of more recent data. So just a little bit about eLife, in case you're not familiar. So it was established in 2011 as an independent not-for-profit. It's supported by a number of funders, Howard Hughes, Wellcome, Wallenberg, Max Planck. And our mission is to accelerate research through different streams: publishing, technology, and culture reform. So, what's the problems with the current system? I mean, you all know this. It's slow, just as Johnny said. It takes to about 9 months from submission to a publication, on average. It undervalues the time of academics. It requires sort of submission, rejection, peer. We all know the story behind that. It doesn't really give enough control to the authors. So often authors are told to go and review their publication, do more experiments. It could take 6 months, it could take 2 years. It establishes authors are not in control of the whole process. And essentially it gives greater weight to where you publish rather than what you publish. So it's not about the article itself, it's often about what journal did you publish the article in. There's something very wrong about that whole facet. So as we know, there's a movement to change this. 2023 was declared the Federal Year of Open Science. And it was this initiative was aimed to advance open and equitable science, which is a lot of the principles that eLife also share. So we think that preprints are the first step in a new process that can encompass this whole idea of open science. So if we were to base a new publication model on preprints, what would we try and improve? What would be our criteria? It would be faster, better for science, good for scientists, more transparent, give more control to the authors, and then just a better value through the whole process. So essentially, this is eLife's new model of publication. I'll just run through it very quickly. It starts off very similar to other models. Author submits, there's a decision of whether that article is sent to review or not. Then there's peer review and consultation, and this happens between the editors and the reviewers. And together they produce a sort of consensus eLife assessment, and the public reviews are published. But the author is, before that happens, an author is given a chance to respond to those particular reviews. And then what's published is this reviewed preprint. Now, it's not changed in any way since it was submitted as a preprint. What we're doing is reviewing the preprint and providing an assessment for it. At that point, authors are given the choice of what to do with their article. They can choose whether they're going to submit it, revise it, and according to some of the feedback and the comments that the reviewers have given, they can say, actually, I'm not going to do any more. Say they have, you know, great comments or whatever, and they think, actually, I'm going to leave it there. Then they can decide that they want to move towards a version of record. Or indeed, you know, we're not saying that you can't send that to another journal. What we're doing is reviewing preprints. So I think that's an important choice. We found that most authors at this point are choosing to revise their manuscript because they're looking for perhaps an updated eLife assessment, which, you know, is an important stamp to their research individually. So what does that look like? Let me just clear that. So we have an indication that it's a reviewed preprint, so we want to make that very clear. And then there's a sort of link if you want to find out about our process. And then there's a history of the article itself. There's a link to the public peer reviews. And there is the important thing is the eLife assessment. So for us, this is really important. And we have the eLife assessment has some common terminology that is used across the different articles. Oops. So is that not doing that? Okay. So here is the table for the common assessment vocabulary. We comment on the significance of the findings and the strength of the evidence. So using, you know, a term from each of these columns, our editor, in cooperation with the reviewers, decide together what the eLife assessment is going to look like. So what's the benefits of this? You know, it's a much faster process. We know that preprints are posted immediately, but it only takes 1 to 3 months between that process and for the publication of the review preprint. It's good for science. You know, it's not an accept-reject decision after the review process has happened. There's detailed assessments of what the reviewers and the editor think of the paper, and comments within the public reviews of how, you know, that particular paper could be improved. It has, obviously, this is very transparent, and because it's quicker, it can lead to, you know, acceleration of that particular field, because these reviews are coming out much more quickly than a standard published article. It's also good for scientists because it values the time of authors and reviewers. There's quality indicators on the articles, and it aligns with funder requirements. Is more transparent, as I've said. You know, the criteria is visible, the peer review comments are published, the author comments are published, each version is tracked and linked to all the way back to the preprint. And it gives that control to authors. You know, authors choose how to respond to the reviews, they choose what amendments that they're going to make, and they decide themselves when they want that article to move towards the version of record. And the whole process is better value. You know, we're a not-for-profit publisher. We're looking for sustainability in our publishing model, not to make profit. So we've managed to reduce the publication fee from $3,000 to $2,000. And of course, we have full waivers available. So what's the reaction to our new publishing model been? So when we announced our model back in October of last year, you know, we had a huge amount of comments from social media. We had about 1 million impressions that day on Twitter. We were trending on Twitter. A lot of people very interested in what we're doing and how we're, you know, thinking about changing publishing. We've also been discussed really widely in different news outlets and different sources. You know, there's a lot of sort of detailed criticism, both positive and negative, about what we're doing and why we're doing it. So what's the progress so far? You know, we're achieving our forecasts and our submissions are increasing steadily. We do have the old model opened because some of our editors felt that that was an important thing to do in the first, you know, 6 months, a year, whatever. So we've had submissions into our old model, but it's only 1 in 10 versus the new model, which is kind of interesting in itself. It's taking about the same amount of time for a paper to be sent to review. But when you look at the publication of that review preprint, we're finding it's around 79 days. Now we do want to make that quicker, but at the moment it's around 79 days. In our old model, it was about 170 days before we published. Obviously, the version of record is different to a review preprint, but actually what we're getting is much more informed messaging on a preprint at a much earlier stage. So we also sent out a perception study, a survey, and we had a lot of comments. It was directed towards people in our network, so obviously they're probably a bit more biased towards eLife. But the top 3 benefits were contributing to that transparency of the process, reducing those wasted rounds of reviews, and obviously accelerating the publication of research. I mean, it's already published as a preprint, but you don't know how much credibility to give it until it's actually gone through peer review. Obviously, our authors are used to looking at preprints, but it was interesting that about over half support these preprints being accompanied by public peer reviews. And unsurprisingly, 97% of those that market also read preprints, with that making up about 30.7% of the total literature that they read. So how are our editors looking at the new model? We've had great support. We've got 2 different groups of editors, or senior editors or reviewing editors. We've had a lot of support for the new model, over 80%, and nearly 80% for both senior and reviewing editors. Many plan to submit to the new model, even more senior editors than their reviewing editors, and the sort of feedback on the assessment is extremely useful, because it's giving assessment on a particular article. And the reader doesn't have to make that subjected to where the article is published. So thank you very much. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Fiona. Nonya, you could get your slides up and ready. We will, if people do have questions, feel free to add them in the chat, but after Nonya's talk, we'll have a Q&A session.
Yes, let me see. Tell me if you're seeing my slides. Hopefully you can see them now.
Yeah.
Yes.
Excellent. So as Fiona, I'm just going to start very briefly introducing PLOS. I assume most of you know what PLOS is or what it stands for. It's also a not-for-profit publisher and advocacy organization. It was launched in the year 2000 by, among, Mike Eisent, among others, Mike being now the editor-in-chief of eLife. So it's a nice closing the circle here. And again, probably therefore not surprisingly, the mission is similar to accelerate progress in science and medicine, transforming research communication. We have a portfolio of journals that are here, and PLOS Mental Health and PLOS Complex Systems have just been announced. So I wanted to give a brief intro about how preprints sit within the PLOS ecosystem. So PLOS as an organization has one of the organizational objectives is to increase the adoption of open science practices of PLOS authors and beyond. And within that, there's a series of work done with open science indicators and other things, but sitting within this this organizational mission is increasing the adoption of preprints. Not only their position, but their use. PLOS was an early adopter of the journal to bioRxiv, bioRxiv to journal workflows, and has always been supportive of receiving submissions that have been pre-printed, etc. And so part of what we're doing is also trying to promote trust in preprints, for example, surfacing the checks and balances that do occur already, although there are minimal checks, some do exist, and trying to interface with preprints to make a more holistic publishing ecosystem the way Johnny and Fiona were talking about. I'm going to skip this this slide because all of us here, I think, understand and support the disruptive potential of preprints. I had another slide because I think one of the things that, at least to me, was surprising, and I think it's because we all kind of speak the same language, but thinking about the percentage of the whole literature that is pre-printed, to me was a little bit of a reality check, because I thought, well, almost everyone uses preprints now. But as of 2021, in the life sciences was around 20% of literature was pre-printed. So I think it's still good to have communities that are energized and active in the promotion, because it's not a done thing, let's say. One of the things that PLOS Biology particularly does, and I'm very proud of, is supporting meta research generally, but also on preprints. And this is just to give you a flavor of the amount of papers across PLOS that are pre-printed. Apologies because this data is a little bit old, until 2021. You'll see decreased levels in PLOS 1, for example, because this is this particular set of data is looking at bioRxiv preprints. And there's quite a bit of PLOS 1 that sits outside of the scope of bioRxiv. Of course, as Johnny was saying, there's much more world than bioRxiv nowadays. There's very many types of preprint servers. And so we have been exploring ways to interface with preprints more effectively and more usefully for the publication process. One early thing that PLOS did, and I'll briefly mention because it's discontinued, but it, I think, gives a flavor of the type of issues we may find, and why I think formalizing preprint peer review is such a good step forward, is that from November 2019 to November 2020, more or less, without knowing that a world pandemic was going to disrupt the whole thing, PLOS set up a preprint commenting trial, which ran across the portfolio on all the papers that that did the J2B workflow, meaning that authors asked us, so PLOS journals, to deposit bioRxiv preprints on their behalf. The end was approximately 1,000, and we were monitoring, actively monitoring comments left on these preprints to try to bring them, surfacing them to help the peer review process, or add nuance, or make it faster, or whatever was useful for it. It was a trial to see. Unfortunately, what happened at the end of the trial is that there were very few comments, and those that were there very seldom actually informed the peer review process. There were more about author updates when they, there was a mistake or something, or they wanted to clarify something, somebody asking a very specific question that got answered, or a congratulations or something like this. The few that were potentially informative, probably because this cohort of papers was journaled to bioRxiv, so were posted almost simultaneously with peer review. So there were a few potentially informative comments that were posted after peer review had finalized. And in the end, PLOS decided that the resources invested in monitoring the comments were not worth the outcome, how useful they were to the process. So, but we remain interested in this space, and looked for other ways to interface with preprints. And as Johnny mentioned, there's an increasing ecosystem of peer review commenting platforms. He has way more than I have here, and this was, again, it's 2021 data. There were like 800, no, something above 700 peer review records on preprints. But this is increasing, as you can see that line, and I'm sure now it's much more. There are also initiatives, I know, like, Arcadia Science has this preprint commenting, preprint peer review pizza days and stuff. So the whole community is trying to increase this practice. And one of the ways, so two very specific ways that we kind of at the organizational level intersect with preprint peer review is through review commons and peer community, in which I'll briefly touch upon. So review commons is journal independent preprint peer review. Basically, authors submit a preprint through the review commons portal. This is then peer reviewed, and those comments are posted on with the preprint on bioRxiv, and the authors are free to send those that package, so the paper, the peer reviews, and either a point-by-point response or already the revised version to any of the journals that form part of the Review Commons initiative. I think authors can use up to 3 go to up to 3 journals, if I'm not mistaken, with the same reviews. And although the reviewer identities are not author-facing, they are journal-facing, so we have all the information we need to continue with the process. PLOS has received 526 submissions to date through Review Commons ever since we started our relationship with them, publishing already to date over 200 papers. PLOS Biology is the highest journal to which submissions are sent, but there's a lot of PLOS pathogens and PLOS genetics as well. 70% of submissions don't require additional reviewers. That's cross-portfolio. I think at PLOS Biology is 90% of submissions. So we really, it's a good expertise coverage and good selection of peer reviewers. So we normally just go with the Review Commons peer reviewers. Rarely do we need to go to anyone outside because somebody has a COI or the expertise is not covered. The acceptance rate hasn't changed all that much. It's slightly higher than for regular submissions, but I would say our editorial assessment takes place first. So independent of whether or not it comes through Review Commons, editors will read the paper and will assess it according to the journal criteria. There is some evidence that that having their peer reviews, maybe authors gauge a little bit better where their paper would sit, and therefore acceptance rate is slightly higher, but that's not, I don't even think if it's statistically significant, though I would have to check. But what is substantially shortened by about 30% is the time to publication, because of course what we're receiving already is past the first checkpoint, right, past the first peer review. Most of the time we receive a revision plan that we then accept, and the authors go away, do it, and come back. Sometimes we already receive the revisions. And the feedback from our editors, our staff editors, and the academic editors across PLOS is that they need more time for an initial assessment. But if they decide to go with the paper, having review reports is definitely useful. Sometimes it makes their decision-making up front more difficult because we don't have the interaction with those reviewers. Those reviewers have been in Review Commons. So, sometimes if they would have to ask something to get to a decision, an initial decision, they feel it's a little bit harder that way. But in general, there's a lot of support for this route. And in PLOS Biology, we're definitely very happy with it. The other more established workflow that we have is with peer community in. We have been, PLOS One and PLOS Biology have been PCI-friendly journals for a long time. The model is relatively similar. So you send a preprint to peer community in, it gets peer reviewed, it gets recommended by a peer community, a peer community, I guess, peer community in whatever the topic community. And then authors can decide to publish it Diamond Open Access with the journal associated with that PCI, which they all have, or they can then submit that to a journal. We have received less papers through PCI, and I don't have good data quantitative data about this, but in general, we also can use those peer reviews quite easily and publish after revisions directly. And lastly, one thing I wanted to touch upon, which is slightly different, but not so much, is the concept of pre-registration. Because as you'll see, there is another peer community for registered reports. This is what I think a very interesting path to publication, which is even more upstream than a preprint. What gets peer reviewed is your project. It's like if it was a small grant, you propose your study, that's what gets peer reviewed. Maybe revisions are required, etc. If it gets accepted, it receives an in-principle acceptance. And what happens after that is you collect the data, you write up your paper, and independent of the results, as long as you followed what your plan was, it will be automatically accepted. So for registered reports, you have to deposit your preprint and the peer reviews in a repository. That can be the Center of Open Science or a number of other repositories, and they can be embargoed because, of course, it's very early on, and some people are worried about scooping, etc. But they don't have to be. And so there is another peer community which is peer community in registered reports, where where those things are deposited openly, so people already know at the project stage what's happening. And we sometimes, we get notified of the peer community in papers that are in principle accepted. And so we will reach out to authors and say, we're interested in this register report. If you're interested in PLOS Biology, please send the stage 2 to us. And again, here we're using peer community and reviewers and review reports. And lastly, I just wanted to mention that we definitely are a supporter of Publish Your Reviews, which is an ASAPbio initiative. Again, personally, one of my pet peeves is the wastefulness of the whole peer review ecosystem. So recycling reviews, if you will. And definitely, if somebody has put the effort to review a paper for us, they own that peer review, and we are totally happy for the peer review to be published with it, such that the information and the assessment is available as early as possible for the community. And if by any chance this doesn't get published with us, those reviews can be used elsewhere. And I think that's me.
Thank you. So we can open up to questions, but before we do that, I have a question. So I would like to know what you both think in, say, 20 years' time. What do you both think the role of journals will be?
Well, I think from our point of view, what we want to happen is really preprints are published, reviews are published on top of that, and actually journals are not, not required at that point. It's like individual components, research assessment on individual journals. I think there's an argument for that journals are communities, and there needs to be another way to make sure that those communities come together. But I think in terms of sort of digital and social media, there's all sorts of ways that you can bring communities together that don't have to be journals. So that's what my preference is.
Yeah, I think I go a little bit in the same direction, although one of the things that I find daunting is the volume of things that are published. And I think they're, maybe not journals. Why journals depends on what kind of tools we all create, right? But there needs to be a way of surfacing things that may be of particular interest to me for X reason, be it topic-wise or advance-wise, etc., versus the rest. Unfortunately, the way the research assessment works, which I think also needs a lot of reform, but the number of things published increases year on year, and in the life sciences is close to 5 million a year. And so I do think there is a need of researchers to somehow sift through what's published to what is relevant to them. Whether that is an overlay journal, I mean, I on the other hand, I absolutely agree that we need a system where the assessment occurs much earlier, where the assessment is not only by 3 people with all the biases that entails, where but the selection of what's to read, I think, is a big problem. And I wonder, you can always have topic specific aggregators and whatever, but I think there's a lot of gain in cross-pollination in reading outside your box, and people reinvent the wheel more and more because they know the literature less and less. And so having ways to surface things that might be of relevance, but you don't yet know that they are of relevance to you, is a big task, I think.
Although I'm hoping that, AI and other things can be much better at doing that than the existing system.
Yes. So if the tools we create are there, then definitely. Although this piece that I was alluding to at the very end of things you don't yet know can be of interest to you, but the browsing bit that we're losing constantly, I think this is hard to reproduce because you can do keyword or whatever language-based thing. But if it's something that would spark an idea or a collaboration, but you don't know it yet, how are you going to look for it,
Yeah, those tools are something else that we've seen sort of developing a lot in the past few years. Things like Cite, which is a really good plugin, especially if you use Zotero for your referencing. Gives you a bit more information on the papers that are in your reference manager now, and that's very helpful. And there's a bunch of really cool tools that you can put some papers in, and then they will seed and tell you what you should be reading after that link to it. And they're interesting to see come up. There's been some questions in the chat. Does anyone in the chat want to ask those? Daniela?
Yeah, I was so surprised at the number of people from the eLife community that it was just 56% that supported publishing the reviews with the preprints, because I had assumed that this would have more support, or
Yeah.
and I wondered what are the doubts, or if you have more information.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting that you put out these surveys and sometimes the results are not quite as you expected. But I think Jessica has, really hit the button there in terms of, there's still hesitation even, amongst people that actually believe in preprinting. So, it's curious, and I think that actually, in terms of seeing it more regularly, I think obviously as people get more used to the idea and see it more associated with the research that they're doing, then I think that percentage will be increased. But I think at the moment, we're starting from lower levels, and it will just take time.
And but do you know any more details, like it's about having unfair reviews, or about people not wanting to have, let's say, the reviews before doing the revision?
No, unfortunately the question was more generic than that, so we have to explore further, really, to find, and I guess we get these headline scores for perception studies, and then we kind of dig into that detail with further follow-up. So that's where we are at the moment.
There's also there was another number where it asked who would submit or plan to submit, and that was also quite low. I mean, it was less than half, I think. So in this case, you also don't know the reason for that. But
I think people tend to when you change business model, you change to something new. People want to wait and see if everybody else they know is doing it as well. And I think there's a bit of that. So we've only launched our model 6 months ago, so I think that people will take time to get used to it, see what others are doing, see who else is submitting, and people in their field submitting. It's just one of those normal human reactions, I think. So we'll see. Our data is only 6 months, and we want to measure that in 12 months and 18 months to see if we're seeing an increase. If we're not, then we've got a problem.
But also, I don't know if I would expect it so much higher. Don't you get people? So our ed board is very supportive of us in our surveys in different measures, but to that specific question, they often come back saying that they think it's a conflict of interest if they publish in the journal that they advise. They see it as too nepotistic and too endogamic, and so some people are very happy to be academic editors, but then submit elsewhere for that reason specifically.
Yeah, that might be true. Again, we'd have to delve into the further detail about those particular subset. So I don't have the answer.
Deepa, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, thanks. So I was wondering if any of these models would allow us to incorporate blind reviews in the future, because preprints would have authors' names, and I mean, there are many biases that rise because of without blind reviews, and we can take care of a lot of biases otherwise through that method. And if it's possible to incorporate in any of these, as a mechanism. So.
Yeah, from our point of view, it's something that we'd quite like to do. We're trying to work our way around how do we do that when obviously the preprints exist, because we've got the way that it's submitted becomes quite complex. But we're definitely trying to figure out ways that we can experiment with sort of blinding different parts of it so that we do reduce bias, because that's something that we're very interested in.
Yeah, and in our case, well, for peer committee, the reviews are always open, but for review commons, the reviewers are blinded unless they want to specifically sign their report. So we as journals participating, we do receive the reviewer identities, but the authors and and the other reviewers, they are blinded.
So it's almost a double-blinded in that way.
No, the reviews are blinded, not the article. I see what you mean. No, I
Okay.
think
Right.
yeah, the actual preprint has authors. Yes.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions they want to ask that aren't in the chat? So I have more. So with peer review, so I mean, Nonya very kindly had one of our papers in there, her talk there. We did a paper about peer review, looking at peer review and whether or not it changed preprints when they were published much. What do you both think about the actual role and importance of peer review? Because one of the things we hear quite often against peer review is that nobody has the time to review all the multitude of papers that are coming out, and every year more papers come out, and that it's harder to find reviewers. And should we really be reviewing all of the literature, or should we be reserving that capacity and reviewing medically relevant papers, or should we be reviewing the ones that make headlines?
Well, yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, the more sort of disaggregation of the articles that come about, and there's a lot of different publishers experimenting with different models where there's bits of code and bits of other things. Like, how is this scientific community going to review everything? And it is a question that we need to start finding solutions for. I think there's the sort of narrative-based article, the sort of typical article that we're used to seeing, 6 experiments, blah blah blah. And I still think that there is value in peer reviewing them the way that we do now. But I think for other article types, then there should be sort of quicker ways to do the peer review, whether it's scorecards or upvoting, whether it's crowdsourced peer review. I think we should be experimenting with different things, because if you think of articles that are sort of small micro publications, are we really going to start reviewing them the same way as we do existing papers? It's just not going to function. So I think one way is having peer review comments on complete articles always available, because think of everything that we're all doing is to make sure that waste of time is not happening, but that only cuts it down by so much. So there's still a problem with increasing amounts of scientific literature. So from my opinion, I hope there's much more innovation in peer review, but I think that needs to also follow other evolutions and innovations in publishing at the same time.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think on the one hand, all surveys I've ever seen of many, where N equals thousands of authors and whatever, invariably majority say they feel their papers have been improved through peer review. So there's that, right? On the other hand, I agree that there's huge volumes of literature, and increasingly so, as we were saying. And so there comes a point where not everything maybe needs to be peer reviewed. I mean, for me, an easy answer, which is hard to implement, but conceptually easy, is that if a paper will interest beyond its own specialist field, then readers are going to be people who don't know so much about it, then this should be peer reviewed, because they will not be able to assess, right? But papers that, whose readership is mostly specialist in that field, each reader will be a peer reviewer, because they will know, right? The problem is, how do you identify that up front? That I don't have an answer for. But I do also want to go in the direction that Fiona was saying about badging and things. So I think there could be a multi-step process where, preprints are looked for DIRC and things like that, and then they're put out. But we could also be looking at whether is the data available, is the code available, you know, all kinds of open science metrics and badging those things. So, you know, you build up, there's this item of research that is surrounded by badges, or however you want to call them, as, that certifies different aspects of it. And then those things that, you know, that will create, I guess, well, what you were saying, Johnny, headlines or being of interest broadly or whatever, then those could go through peer review. But yeah, how that works in practice is hard to say. But short answer is, I don't think 5 million pieces of research need to be peer reviewed every year.
We are running out of time, but I want to give people more time to do the Q&A rather than the interactive activity, so we'll keep going. But if you could try and be concise with questions and answers, if that's possible. Theodora, you had your hand up. Have you still got a question?
It was more of a comment on this. I mean, the growth of research reflects a growth in the number of people doing research and the amount they're putting out. It's not just that we've got the same number of people churning out more and more research. We've got more people in the enterprise, so it ought to be possible to have them assess the work. Of course, you hear the problem if what you do is keep going to the same subset of people in Anglophone, you know, Northern, etc. But the second thing is, I think, to distinguish, and we sort of were inching towards it, between the technical soundness review, which is the PLOS One review, if you will, has this been done properly, which can be done by a lot of different types of people and by machines in some settings, versus a kind of narrative claims where, you know, as Nadia was hinting, the bigger the claim, the more you want someone to have assessed whether it's likely to be true. So it's sort of, I'm sure it's going to be some combination of all of the above, machines, crowdsourced, but also some expertise applied that is relevant to the work that was done.
Julia?
Hi, I just did some research, also published about pre-peer review and post-peer review, and it seems like in terms of some fraudulent papers or papers that have some problems, the pre-peer review process is not as effective as you know, post-peer review process, right? So I was wondering if there is a plan to kind of leave this open commenting system for you know, open for after the paper is published, so that there would be possible to post peer review, you know, post publication. I hope I explained myself, but yeah, if you have some questions, I can clarify.
I can take this one at least very briefly. So I think you're totally right, and that goes to what I was saying, that peer reviewers are 3 to 5 people, and post peer review, it's the whole community, right? And so for sure, our commenting facility is open all the time, and people do some. So we've had recently a correction posted because the material methods were not clear in a paper because somebody commented there. So that works to some extent. But one of the things that is also, I think, industry is moving towards is implementing AI-assisted pre-publication checks in a much more systematic manner. I think these are still costly and not sufficiently accurate to be worth the expense for many publishers, but it's moving in that direction where, I mean, plagiarism checks, I think most people do, but there are other types of checks that can be done in an automated manner, and these are coming soon, I think. Having said that, this is a Red Queen situation. You know, you will stop one type of paper mill or whatever, or fraud, and another one will pop up, I'm sure.
Yeah, in a way, like I don't know how if effective is pre-peer review versus post-peer review. In some way, you know, it seems like the comments are more profound in a post-publication somehow.
You know, research is never finished. It's that's what's interesting. You know, an author might draw a line over, you know, under it and say, look, this is my final of this particular bit of research. But if research goes on and on top of that, so I think it's always useful to continue that conversation, and it might, you know, end up in a different paper by the same authors or a different group of authors or whatever. You know, research is never finished. So anything that kind of adds to the sort of discourse is always very useful.
Yeah, thank you.
And of course, some might consider preprints as published. Just add
Well,
that
there
in.
certainly are citable items, right? So.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so I'm just going to end with some ASAPbio updates from our end. So we have a couple of surveys out at the moment, actually. We've got a survey on preprint as a requirement for graduation, and we're asking for responses to that until probably the end of this month, and then we're going to close that survey. We've had some great responses that have been very helpful so far, and a few more would be great. We've also are trying to get some stories of people based in India who have pre-printed so that we can share their stories with people and start more of a campaign around preprint awareness across India. The other survey we've got going on at the moment, we've just launched, is a survey around the perceptions of preprints for Africa-based researchers. This is a slightly longer survey than the other two, but we really want responses to this one because this is going to help us direct our efforts moving forward around how we can get more engaged with the African community and preprints. So that is all from today's session, which is just ending on time. Thank you everyone for all of the questions. Thank you, Fiona and Nonya, for your presentations. If anyone does have more questions or just wants to get in touch, you can find us on Twitter, Mastodon. I'm sure we'll be on some of the other ones soon as well. I think we're on Threads now. Or you can email me or Jessica, and I'm sure Nonya and Fiona are happy for you to get in touch as well.
Yes.
And this recording will be available in a slightly edited version afterwards. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.